the operating theater has a way of swallowing you whole, especially when the night shift settles in. The sterile light hums quietly overhead, casting a pale glow on the gleaming steel instruments and the antiseptic blue drapes that surround the table. It's a place where time warps, minutes stretch endlessly, and hours vanish in the blur of urgency and precision. I've been a surgeon for nearly 2 decades, and there's a peculiar stillness that always creeps in before the chaos takes hold. It's like the calm before a storm, a fleeting moment when the weight of what's to come presses down in silence. Tonight was one of those nights. I remember the way the air felt, thick and expectant, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The team was assembled, scrubbed in and ready, but none of us spoke much. We all knew this shift would demand everything we had. The ER had been unusually busy earlier, but now the pace slowed, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. My phone buzzed sharply against the stainless steel counter, a call from the trauma team. The voice on the other end was clipped, urgent. A multiple trauma patient was en route, injured in a high-speed collision. The paramedics had reported severe blunt force injuries, unstable vital signs, and the possibility of internal bleeding. They were racing against time, and so were we. The minutes that followed were a blur of preparations. Nurses checked and rechecked equipment, anesthesiologists readied medications, and radiology technicians stood by for immediate imaging. I reviewed the patient's incoming data: young male, mid-30s, no helmet, high-velocity impact. The details painted a grim picture. Car accidents like these rarely ended well without swift intervention. The operating room felt colder somehow, as if the very walls anticipated the gravity of what was to come. When the gurney slid through the double doors, the room snapped into motion. The paramedics gave a rapid report as they transferred the patient to the table: multiple fractures, suspected internal bleeding, and a blood pressure that was dangerously low. The man's chest rose and fell shallowly, a fragile rhythm that teetered on the edge of collapse. His face was pale, smeared with dirt and dried blood, eyes fluttering briefly but mostly closed. I scrubbed in swiftly, my hand steady despite the lump in my throat. The team worked like a well-oiled machine, 4 lines placed, airway secured, and rapid ultrasound performed to assess for internal bleeding. The sound of the monitors beeped intermittently, sometimes flatlining, then spiking as medications took effect. Every second felt like a lifetime. The trauma surgeon beside me called out findings: fluid in the abdomen, unstable pelvis fracture, signs of a tension pneumothorax. We had to move fast. I gave orders for a massive transfusion protocol and directed the team to prepare for an emergent laparotomy. The patient's pulse was weak, barely palpable, but it was there, stubbornly clinging to life. As the anesthesiologist stabilized the airway and sedation deepened, I made the first incision. The moment the scalpel pierced the skin, the sterile theater dissolved into a battleground. Blood pooled quickly, obscuring vision, and the team fought to control hemorrhage. The patient's vital signs fluctuated wildly, each beep and flatline echoing in the room like a countdown. Despite the chaos, every move was precise: clamps applied, vessels ligated, organs inspected for damage. The pressure in the abdomen was immense, a silent enemy threatening to suffocate what little life remained. I could feel the weight of responsibility settle over me, heavier than any scalpel or retractor. This was more than medicine, it was a desperate dance with death. At one point, I caught a glimpse of the man's face beneath the sterile drapes, his features slack, eyes closed, but somehow peaceful. It struck me how fragile the line between life and death really is. One moment, a person is whole and breathing; the next, a collection of systems failing under the relentless assault of trauma. The night stretched on, a relentless tide of interventions and assessments. Nurses called out labs and blood gas results, while the anesthesiologist adjusted support to keep the heart beating. We drained pockets of blood from the chest, patched lacerated intestines, and stabilized fractures as best we could. The man's pulse remained erratic, a tenuous thread that we fought to preserve. In those moments, time ceased to feel like a linear progression. It was as if each heartbeat was an eternity, a fragile victory snatched from the jaws of oblivion. The operating room became a crucible where skill, hope, and sheer will collided. Outside, the hospital buzzed with life, but inside, it was just us and the patient, locked in a battle that defied guarantees. As dawn began to tint the windows with a pale glow, we finally achieved a measure of stability. The hemorrhage was controlled, vital signs steadied, and the patient was packaged for transfer to the ICU. Exhausted but relieved, I stepped back, letting the team take over the delicate balance of postoperative care. Yet, even as I scrubbed out and removed my mask, the weight of the night lingered. The stillness at the start had given way to a storm, but the outcome remained uncertain. In surgery, you learn that sometimes skill isn't enough, and the body has its own will to survive or surrender. Tonight was a reminder of that fragile edge we walk. I leaned against the sterile wall for a moment, the hum of the hospital waking up around me. The trauma bay was quiet now, but it held the ghosts of the night's battles, the echoes of lives hanging by threads, the sounds of monitors and whispered urgencies. There was no room for doubt or regret, only the relentless drive to face whatever came next. In this dim theater, beneath the harsh lights and cold steel, life and death played out in a dance as old as time. And I was both witness and participant, forever marked by the patients who passed through, leaving traces that linger long after the last stitch is placed. The night was far from over, but for now, the storm had paused, and I was left with the quiet knowledge that every second mattered, and every life deserved the fight. The steady rhythm of the oar was punctuated by the relentless beep of monitors and the hurried voices of the team. We had stabilized the patient enough to begin the definitive repairs, but the tension in the room was palpable. Every breath, every movement, felt like an exercise in defying the inevitable. The trauma was severe, and despite our best efforts, the man's body was teetering on the edge. As I leaned over the surgical field, the fluorescent lights above casting sharp shadows, I could feel the pulse under my fingertips, weak, irregular, but unmistakably alive. The heart was battered, bruised by the impact, yet it kept trying. We administered vasopressors, pushed fluids, and transfused blood, desperate to maintain perfusion. The anesthesiologist's voice was calm but edged with urgency, tracking the numbers that danced dangerously close to zero. Then, something happened that none of us were prepared for. The heart monitor flatlined, silence filled the room. The man was clinically dead. We stopped. The team froze, eyes flicking between the screen and the patient. Protocol dictated that we call time of death, but before I could signal, there was a flicker on the monitor. A single, faint pulse. Then another. The heart, against all reason, had resumed beating. It was brief, barely more than a heartbeat, but enough to shatter the sterile logic we cling to in medicine. The room held its breath. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold, but from the impossible. We all knew the criteria for death: flatline, no brain activity, northwest respiratory drive. Yet here was this stubborn organ, defying every expectation, pulsing faintly as if to say, "I'm still here." We scrambled to respond, reigniting the efforts to resuscitate. The pulse was erratic, weak, but undeniably present. Nurses double-checked the leads on the monitor, anesthesiology adjusted medications, and I resumed compressions when the rhythm faltered. The heart's ghostly beat persisted for several minutes, a flickering ember in a room saturated with despair and hope. No one spoke of the phenomenon aloud, but the unease was palpable. I documented the event with clinical precision: time of flatline, duration of spontaneous electrical activity, interventions administered, but inside, I wrestled with a gnawing disbelief. Medicine is a science, grounded in evidence and protocols. Yet, in that moment, something transcended the textbook definitions. The boundary between life and death, usually so clear, blurred in the dim light of the operating room. The surgical team moved with renewed urgency, aware that this fragile spark might be the difference between salvage and loss. We completed repairs on the damaged vessels, controlled internal bleeding, and reassessed organ function. The patient's heart continued to flutter, a tenuous thread connecting him to life. Throughout the ordeal, I couldn't shake the feeling that the heart had a will beyond our understanding, as if it was aware that it was fighting not just to keep the body alive, but perhaps, in some inexplicable way, to cling to its own existence. The surgeon in me wanted to rationalize it, to attribute the pulse to electrical noise or residual myocardial activity, but the experience lingered like a whisper at the edge of reason. As the patient was eventually stabilized enough for transfer to the ICU, the room exhaled collectively. The monitors now showed a steady rhythm, though faint, and the respirator took over the work of breathing. We had bought time, but the battle was far from over. Later, in the quiet of the staff lounge, I shared the events with a few colleagues. Their faces mirrored my own mixture of awe and skepticism. One nurse suggested it was the heart's last defiance, a final gasp of life refusing to yield. Another joked darkly that maybe death wasn't ready to take him just yet. We all laughed, but beneath the humor was a shared acknowledgement that sometimes medicine encounters the unexplainable. That night, sleep eluded me. I kept replaying the moment when the heart pulsed against the silence, a flicker of life in the void. It challenged everything I thought I knew about mortality. Was it merely a physiological quirk, or something more? A sign that the line between life and death isn't as absolute as we believe. In the days that followed, I reviewed the patient's charts obsessively, searching for clues. The neurologists confirmed brain death, yet the heart's brief revival remained an anomaly. This ghostly pulse became a story whispered among the staff, a reminder that beneath the clinical precision and protocols, medicine still grapples with mysteries. The experience changed something in me. It deepened my respect for the resilience of the human body and the enigma of life itself. In that operating room, under harsh lights and cold steel, we had witnessed a heartbeat that shouldn't have been. It was a moment suspended between science and the unknown, a quiet defiance that haunted me long after the monitors went silent. I keep that memory close, a reminder that sometimes, the body speaks in ways we can't fully understand. The pulse was more than a sign of life, it was a whisper from the edge of existence, a fleeting glimpse of the mystery that binds us all. And as surgeons, we stand at that edge every day, cutting between the worlds of life and death, never quite sure where one ends and the other begins. The night had already stretched into its deepest hours when the call came to prepare for an organ transplant. It was a quiet interlude after the chaos of the trauma surgery, but the weight of what lay ahead was no less heavy. The patient we had just stabilized was scheduled to donate a kidney, a final act of generosity after the grim prognosis. The transplant team assembled swiftly, their movements practiced and precise, ready to extend life through this incredible gift. The operating room was sterile and silent except for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional murmur of instructions. The recipient lay waiting in a neighboring OR, prepped and anesthetized, the hope of a second chance resting on the success of this procedure. As the donor's abdomen was reopened, the surgical field bathed in the harsh light, the team moved with surgical choreography, exposing vessels, carefully dissecting tissue, preserving structures vital for the kidney's function. The organ itself was soon visible, its surface glistening, a strange juxtaposition of life and death. We followed every protocol meticulously, temperature control, sterile handling, and timing. The kidney was carefully detached, its blood supply clamped and sealed, ready for immediate transport. That's when the impossible happened. The kidney vanished. One moment it was resting in the sterile basin beside me, the next, it was gone. The room froze. Instruments were still. Eyes darted across the field. Nurses checked trays, the back table, and even the floor. The organ was nowhere to be found. I called out, voice steady but laced with disbelief, "Where's the kidney?" A frantic search ensued. The surgical techs ransacked the sterile field, the circulating nurse scanned the room, but the kidney had simply disappeared from sight. It was as if it had evaporated into the thin air that filled the OR. Minutes passed, minutes that felt like hours. The tension in the room thickened, a palpable fog of confusion and unease. The transplant team, usually unflappable, exchanged worried glances. This was no time for mistakes, every second mattered. Then, just as suddenly as it vanished, the kidney reappeared. It was resting on the far side of the room, on a counter well outside the sterile field, untouched and perfectly preserved. No one had been near that area during the procedure, it was impossible for it to have been moved there without breaking sterility or being noticed. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. How had the kidney traveled such a distance unseen? Who or what had moved it? The logical mind scrambled for answers, distraction, misplacement, human error, but none fit the facts. The transplant surgeon carefully retrieved the kidney, inspecting it for damage. It was pristine, as though untouched by the bizarre journey it had just taken. We resumed the procedure, transplanting the organ with all the care and precision it demanded. Throughout the operation, the atmosphere remained charged with an undercurrent of disbelief. The team worked silently, each person wrestling privately with the strange event. The kidney's disappearance and reappearance defied every rule we relied on in the OR. It was a glitch in the fabric of reality, an unexplainable breach in the sterile, controlled world we inhabit. After the transplant concluded successfully, I sat back for a moment, hands still gloved but trembling slightly. The room was quiet save for the steady beep of monitors and the soft rustle of gowns. I couldn't shake the image of the kidney, vanished and returned, as if by some unseen hand. Later, in the break room, the story spread like wildfire among the staff. Some dismissed it as a trick of fatigue or misremembering, but others, especially those who had been in the room, spoke in hushed tones about the eerie experience. One nurse mentioned that the OR sometimes felt alive, like the building itself was watching, shifting things when no one was looking. I found myself staring at the sterile walls, wondering what forces lurked just beyond our perception. Medicine prides itself on certainty, on evidence and reproducibility, but that night reminded me how fragile that certainty can be. The kidney's mysterious journey remains a puzzle. No one could offer a rational explanation, and the incident was quietly filed away in the hospital's collective memory as one of those inexplicable moments that defy logic. Yet, for those of us who witnessed it, the event left a lingering unease, a whisper that sometimes, the boundaries of the physical world bend in ways we aren't ready to understand. In surgery, we are trained to trust our senses, our knowledge, and our protocols. But every so often, the impossible slips through the cracks, reminding us that beneath the veneer of science lies a world much stranger and more mysterious than we like to admit. The kidney had vanished like a ghost, a fleeting shadow crossing the threshold between reality and something beyond. And as I scrubbed out that night, the sterile room felt a little less certain, the walls a little less solid. The transplant had saved a life, but it also left behind a question mark, an unspoken acknowledgement that even in the most controlled environments, the unknown waits patiently in the shadows. The night's rhythm was interrupted yet again when 2 ambulances arrived within minutes of each other, each carrying a patient battered by near-identical trauma. It was the kind of coincidence that immediately sets a surgeon's senses on edge, not just because of the sheer volume of work, but because of the uncanny symmetry that seemed to echo in the air. Both patients were young men, roughly the same age, both involved in separate high-speed car accidents on the same stretch of highway. Each had sustained nearly identical injuries, bilateral rib fractures, flail chests, and severe abdominal contusions. The paramedics' reports were eerily similar: loss of consciousness at the scene, hypotension, and signs consistent with internal bleeding. The hospital shifted into overdrive, and I was summoned back to the OR to manage what promised to be a grueling night. As I prepared for the first surgery, a strange sensation crept over me, like staring into a mirror. The first patient lay pale and fragile on the table, tubes and monitors surrounding him like a mechanical cocoon. His chest rose and fell with labored effort, the bruising vivid against his skin. We moved quickly, securing airways, stabilizing circulation, and preparing for emergency thoracotomies. Minutes later, the second patient was wheeled in, the scene repeating itself with unsettling precision. I glanced from one table to the other, struck by the eerie symmetry. It felt as if fate had arranged a morbid twin experiment, a cruel reflection of trauma and chance. The surgical teams worked side by side, each focused on salvaging life from near destruction. The first patient's condition was grave. His lungs were compromised, bleeding profusely, and the abdominal cavity a battlefield of ruptured vessels and contused organs. We fought to control the hemorrhage, patching lacerations and packing the abdomen to buy time. The second patient mirrored this struggle, his body equally ravaged, his vital signs wavering dangerously. Despite the frenetic pace, I found myself haunted by the parallel unfolding before me. It wasn't just the injuries, it was the uncanny resemblance in timing, presentation, and even subtle details, like the same faded tattoo on their forearms and the identical scars from childhood surgeries. No connection had been found between them, they were strangers, yet linked by some inexplicable thread. As the hours dragged on, both patients deteriorated despite our best efforts. The surgical interventions bought time, but their bodies were battered beyond repair. The first patient's heart stopped just as the second was prepped for an emergency procedure. We pronounced death with heavy hearts, the room heavy with exhaustion and grief. The second patient's surgery continued, a race against collapsing systems. His vital signs flickered unpredictably, and despite aggressive resuscitation, the damage was irreversible. I stood outside the OR for a moment, the weight of the night settling around me like a suffocating fog. The coincidence gnawed at me. 2 men, strangers in life, brought together by fate in death, their stories intertwined by the cruel symmetry of trauma. It was as if the universe had mirrored their pain, casting a reflection that neither science nor logic could explain. Later, in quiet moments, I found myself replaying their faces, the echo of their injuries, and the strange parallels that had bound their fates. It was a surreal reminder that in medicine, we are often confronted not only by the fragility of life but by patterns that defy understanding. The hospital halls seemed to whisper their stories long after the operating rooms fell silent. I wondered if somewhere, in the spaces between life and death, These two men were connected, reflections of one another's struggle, shadows cast by the same tragic event. In trauma surgery, you learn to brace for the unpredictable, but sometimes it's the patterns themselves that haunt you. That night, the mirror patient phenomenon lingered in my mind, a puzzle without a solution and a reminder that fate often plays a role far beyond our control. There's a strange energy that settles over the operating room when the night drags on long past what anyone thought possible. You begin to notice things that don't quite fit, the flicker of lights just at the edge of your vision, the whisper of voices when the room is supposed to be silent, shadows moving where no one stands. It's as if the very air becomes charged with something unexplainable, a presence that lingers just beyond the reach of reason. That night, after the twin traumas and the vanished kidney, the OR felt different. The staff, usually so focused and unshakable, began sharing stories in hushed tones, tales of strange occurrences that had become almost routine yet never quite rationalized. Nurses spoke of hearing footsteps in empty corridors, surgeons mentioned instruments moving slightly between cases, and anesthesiologists reported monitors glitching without cause. One particular corner of the room seemed to attract these phenomena, a shadowed space near the scrub sinks where the light never quite settled. Several team members swore they'd seen a figure, a soldier in uniform, sitting quietly in that corner during late-night shifts. No one ever approached the apparition, it was more of an acknowledged presence, a silent witness to the lives hanging in the balance beneath the harsh surgical lights. I remember one quiet moment after a long procedure. An elderly patient, frail and kind, had just passed on the table, the monitors flatlining softly. As the team prepared to clean up, I glanced toward that shadowy corner and saw a vague shape, indistinct but unmistakably there. It felt almost like a guardian, a sentinel watching over those who walk the final path. These experiences aren't things you write in official reports or discuss openly in meetings. They dwell in the margins of medical practice, whispered among colleagues who understand that sometimes, science and the supernatural brush against one another in ways we can't fully explain. I've come to think of the OR as a threshold, where life and death meet, and where the veil between worlds thins. It's a place of miracles and heartbreak, where the human spirit is tested and sometimes transcends its limits. The strange occurrences are reminders that beneath the sterile surfaces and clinical detachment, there's a deeper mystery at play. As the night wore on, I found myself quietly acknowledging the presence in that corner, a silent nod to whatever it was that watched over us. It gave a strange comfort amidst the chaos and loss, a sense that we were not entirely alone. In the ER and the OR, you become attuned to the rhythms of life and death, to the fragile balance that sustains us. But sometimes, there are moments that defy explanation, ghostly pulses, vanished organs, mirrored fates, and shadows that linger. They remind us that medicine, for all its advances, is still practiced in a world where the unknown holds sway. I've shared this story not just to recount events, but to invite others who walk these halls, nurses, doctors, techs, and all who witness the thin line between worlds, to share their own tales. There's a strange camaraderie in these shared mysteries, a community bound by the unexplainable experiences that define the edges of our work. So if you've ever felt the brush of the unseen in a hospital corridor, heard a whisper when no one else was there, or witnessed a heartbeat that shouldn't be, know that you are not alone. These are the echoes of lives lived and lost, the shadows that linger long after the heart monitor flatlines. In the end, perhaps that's what we carry with us, the knowledge that beyond the science and the protocols, there is a vast, unseen world that touches us all. And in that space, between certainty and mystery, we find the true weight of our work. If you love the story, like the video and subscribe.